The first thing you should know about Dana Kessler is that for 11 days I did not learn her rank, and on the 12th I would have given anything I own to have known it sooner. She came out to us on a resupply bird into Outpost Kazan wearing the same faded fatigues the rest of the attached civilians wore, no tapes, no flag, a soft boonie hat gone the color of river mud. The manifest had one word next to her name: analyst. She carried her own ruck off the ramp, which none of the other attached people did, and she carried it easy, the way you carry something you have carried a long way before. I was 23 years old, and I was the radio operator for a mixed patrol element in the Marisol Basin, and I did not give her a second look. In that place, you learned fast that the jungle was the only thing that could kill you, and a quiet woman with a clipboard was not the jungle. I want to be honest about that, because the whole of this story turns on how wrong a young man can be and how long it can take him to know it. The Marisol was triple canopy, a green so total that noon came down through it like water through moss, gray and slow. It rained without schedule and without mercy. Everything you owned went soft and then went sour. There was a river called the Kazan that the outpost took its name from, brown and swollen, and past the river there were low ridges where the militia moved, men who knew the ground the way I knew the back of my own hand and better. We were there to keep a road open and to gather what could be gathered, and every soul at that outpost was counting days. The team was a patchwork. There were 8 of us who wore the uniform, run by a staff sergeant named Ochoa who was steady and tired in equal measure. There were 3 security contractors run by a man named Del Marsh, who had a loud voice and a loud watch, and a way of talking about the locals that made Ochoa go quiet and hard around the mouth. There was an interpreter, an older man named Hattie who prayed at dawn and shared his tea. And there was the analyst, Kessler, who spoke to almost no one and watched everything. I noticed that much about her even then. She watched, not nervous, not jumpy, the opposite. She'd sit at the edge of the wire in the evening with a canteen cup gone cold in her hands, and she'd read the tree line the way Hattie read his little book, slow, left to right and back. Once I came off a comms shift near midnight and she was still there, and I asked her if she couldn't sleep, just to be saying something, and she said, "I sleep fine. I just like to know the ground." I thought it was a strange thing for an analyst to say. I filed it under strange and forgot it. Marsh had opinions about her. He had opinions about everything, but he had a particular one about the quiet woman drawing pay to sit at a folding table. Ballast, he called her once, at the plywood table where we ate, loud enough to carry. They send us ballast and call it support. One of his contractors laughed. Kessler kept eating. She didn't look up and she didn't color and she didn't answer, and I remember thinking she must be soft, must be the kind of person who let things roll off because she had no stones to throw back. I had the whole of it backwards. She wasn't taking it. She was measuring him, the way you'd measure a stretch of bad trail, and deciding it wasn't worth the boots. The patrol that broke everything went out on a gray morning with the rain holding off. The task was simple on paper. Walk the trace of the old logging road 2 clicks north to a bend the maps called the Elbow, confirm a culvert wasn't wired, come home. Ochoa didn't like it. He said the Elbow was a good place to be hit and a bad place to be hit in, and he said it to the officer on the radio, and the officer said walk it anyway. So we walked it. 8 in uniform, 3 of Marsh's men, Hattie and the analyst, who was tasked along to eyeball something at the culvert that the desk wanted eyeballed. I walked the middle of the file with the radio, sweating through my 3rd shirt of the morning. Kessler walked ahead of me. I watched the back of her boonie hat and I watched where she put her feet, and somewhere in the 1st kilometer a small wrong thing worked its way into me and I couldn't name it. She didn't walk like the other attached people. The contractors clumped and drifted. Hattie shuffled. Kessler moved like the ground was a language she was reading as she went. She stepped where the roots were, not where the mud was. She went quiet over the wet leaf litter that made the rest of us sound like a herd, and every so often, without breaking stride, she'd look up and off to one side of the trail at nothing I could see, and then look back down. I told myself it was nothing. In that country, I told myself a lot of things. We were 400 meters short of the elbow when the jungle came apart. I have tried in the years since to lay it out in order, and the truth is that an ambush does not happen in order. It happens all at once and then it happens forever. The first burst came from the high ground to our right, and it took Ruiz, one of Ochoa's men, before any of us had cleared a throat. Then it was noise, all of it, a wall of it, rounds coming through the leaves like something tearing, mud jumping, men shouting the short animal words men shout, and the whole file going to ground in the muck. I got the radio up. I remember my own voice very far away, calling contact, calling the grid, and I remember the officer's voice coming back small and useless from the outpost, and I remember Ochoa low beside me putting rounds into the ridge with a calm that I did not feel and would never forget. We had walked into it exactly where Ochoa said we would. Here is the part I have carried. In the middle of that noise, flat in the mud with my thumb on the radio, I looked up the file for Kessler, because some part of me had already decided she was the one who wouldn't make it, the ballast, the analyst, and she wasn't where she'd been. She'd moved. She was off the trail to the left, down behind the root buttress of a hardwood, and she had her weapon up, and she was not spraying and she was not screaming. She fired twice, a pause, twice more, deliberate, her head level, and I saw one of the muzzle flashes on the ridge simply stop, and then another shift its position hard like a man who has learned respect. She was calling something too, short and clear, corrections, calling them to Ochoa and to no one, and Ochoa was answering her, moving his fire where she called it. In the worst 4 seconds of my young life, the two people who were fighting the ambush instead of surviving it were the tired staff sergeant and the woman with the clipboard. I didn't have time to understand it, because that was when the second element hit us from the low ground, from the riverside, and cut the file in half. Everything after that was the bug out. Ochoa was hit in the leg. 2 of the contractors were down. Marsh was screaming for the river, screaming to break contact and run for the chasm and the boats, and there is a kind of panic that is contagious, and it went through the survivors like fire through the canopy. We grabbed who we could grab. I got Ochoa's arm over my shoulder and my radio was still on my back, and we went crashing downhill, the disciplined file gone, just men and terror moving toward water. I thought Kessler was behind us. I want that written down. In the smoke and the green I thought she was with the rear, that she was one of the shapes moving in the murk, and I did not count heads because you cannot count heads while you are carrying a man and being shot at. We hit the river bank and Marsh's remaining man had the boats and we loaded the wounded, and I turned to reach back up the slope for the rest, and Marsh had my arm. "Everybody's up," he said. His face was gray and wild. "Everybody that's coming is up, we go." "The analyst," I said. "Kessler, she's not." "She's gone," Marsh said. "She's a mile back and she's gone, and I'm not losing this boat for a clipboard." And when I pulled against him, he put his weight on it and another contractor grabbed my vest, and Ochoa, half conscious against the gunwale, could not lift his head, and the boat was already sliding into the brown current, and I was 23 years old, and I let them pull me down into it. That is the disrespect, if you want the clean word for it, not the ballast, not the ridicule at the plywood table. The disrespect was a man deciding, in 4 seconds in a panic, that Dana Kessler was worth less than a boat, and 11 of us letting the current carry us away from her while she was still up there in the green, alive, fighting alone. I told myself for a long time that I hadn't decided it, that Marsh decided it and I was only carried. But I was in the boat. I was in the boat and she was in the jungle. And no amount of telling changes which of those two things is true. We didn't hear a single shot from behind us as the river took us south. In my worst nights, I used to think that silence meant the end of her. I had that backwards too. Outpost Kazan received 11 of us, and it received us like men who had left something behind, because we had. They took the wounded off the boats, and Ochoa went out on the first bird with a medic working on his leg, and the rest of us stood in the mud while the rain finally came, and no one would look at anyone. Hattie the interpreter had made it. He stood apart and prayed, and I could not tell if it was thanks or something harder. 2 men were dead on the ridge behind us. One contractor was missing, and the analyst was missing, and I was the only one who kept saying her name. She was fighting, I told the outpost commander, a captain named Reyes who was too young for the job and knew it. She wasn't panicking. She had her weapon up and she was calling corrections to Ochoa. She might be. She's a civilian analyst, Marsh said. He'd found his voice again, and his voice had found the version of events that let him sleep. She was at the back of the file when it went bad. I gave the order to break to the river because we'd have lost everyone. That's on the officer that sent us up that road, not me. He said it looking at the captain, but he said it for the rest of us, and I watched two of the uniformed men who'd been in that boat nod slowly, because it was easier to nod. The math of it was already setting like concrete. 12 went out. 11 came back plus 2 confirmed dead. 1 unaccounted. And the one unaccounted was the least of them. The ballast, the clipboard, and the story that formed itself in that muddy yard was that she had simply been unlucky and slow, and that no one could have done anything, and that we had done the hard right thing by saving the many. I couldn't make it set in me the way it set in them. I kept seeing her behind that root buttress, firing twice and pausing, level-headed, calling the ridge. I kept hearing Ochoa answer her. Men who are ballast do not do that. I said as much to Captain Reyes, and he looked at me the way a tired man looks at a problem he can't afford. And he said the recovery of an unaccounted civilian in militia-held triple canopy was above his outpost and above his rank, and that it would go up, and that I should get some sleep. I didn't sleep. I sat at the edge of the wire where she used to sit, and I read the tree line the way I'd seen her read it, and I understood nothing about it except that it had swallowed her and that we had helped it. Marsh's men were already talking about the extraction like a story that was over. Rotation, they were saying. Replacements. The green went black as the rain came down, and somewhere out past the chasm, though I had no way to know it and would not have believed it, Dana Kessler was on her first night alone in that jungle, cutting the noise of the boats out of her memory, going still, and beginning to plan. The Marisol Basin was a place people were sent to and not a place anyone came to. And so, when the second bird came in 3 days later and it was not a resupply bird, the whole outpost stopped to watch it land. 8 men came off the ramp, and the yard went quiet in a way I had not heard it go quiet. They wore no tapes and no names, and they wore the jungle like they'd been poured into it, and they moved off the bird in a loose spread that took in the whole outpost in one pass without a single one of them seeming to look at anything. I had been in that country long enough to know a working naval special warfare platoon when one walked past me, and I had never been close to one, and the first thing I felt, God help me, was relief. The cavalry. Somebody had sent the cavalry for the analyst. Their lead was a broad, weathered man, older than the rest, with gray coming in at the temples and eyes that had already counted every man in the yard and filed us. He found Captain Reyes and the two of them talked low, and then Reyes brought him to us, to the 11 who'd come back, and the man looked down the ragged line of us and asked a question I did not expect. Which of you was closest to Nettle when it went bad? Nobody answered. We didn't know the word. Marsh, who could never let a silence stand, said, "There's no Nettle on our manifest. We had an analyst, civilian, Kessler. She was lost in the ambush." He said lost the way you'd say a set of keys. The SEAL lead looked at Marsh for a long moment and something moved behind his eyes and was put away. "Kessler," he said. "Right, Kessler." And the way he said the name, careful like a man handling something that belonged to him, was the first crack in the concrete story of that yard. He turned from Marsh, who wasn't worth his time, and he found me, I don't know how, maybe because I was the one leaning forward, and he said, "You, radio, walk with me." His name, or the name he gave me, was Master Chief Boyd. We walked the wire and he asked me to tell him exactly what I'd seen, and something in the flat patience of him pulled it out of me straighter than I'd told anyone, including myself. I told him about the root buttress. I told him she fired twice and paused and fired twice more and didn't spray. I told him she called corrections to Ochoa and Ochoa answered her. I told him she'd sat at the wire every night reading the tree line, and said she liked to know the ground. I told him she'd walked the trail stepping on the roots and not the mud, quiet where the rest of us were loud. I was braced, I think, for him to tell me I'd imagined it, that grief and guilt had dressed a dead clerk up as a soldier. Instead, Master Chief Boyd stopped walking. He looked out at the tree line the way she used to, and he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "Fired in pairs. Called the ridge for your sergeant. Walked the roots." He nodded slowly to himself. "Yeah, that's her." "Who is she?" I said. It didn't come out as a question. It came out as a thing I needed. "Chief Petty Officer Dana Kessler," Boyd said. "Special reconnaissance. She's not an analyst, son. The analyst was the cover so she could sit at your outpost and read that valley without the militia knowing naval special warfare had eyes in the Marisol." He started walking again, and I fell in because my legs did it without me. There are men in my community who teach survival and evasion, and then there's the person who taught a lot of them. Kessler's done escape and evasion instruction for 3 workups. She spent a piece of her life learning how to be one person alone in exactly this kind of green and not be found and not be caught and come out the far side of it functioning. We've got a call sign for her from a selection a long time ago. Nettle, because you don't see the thing that stings you until you're already in it, and because she comes back. I remember the yard, the wet plywood, the rain starting again, and Marsh maybe 30 feet away pretending not to listen and listening. I remember the exact feeling of the concrete story cracking all the way through and something cold coming up underneath it. Because if what Boyd said was true, then the woman we had left in the jungle was not the least survivable person on that patrol. She was the most, by a distance none of us could have imagined. We had looked at the one human being in that valley best equipped to live through being left alone in it, and we had called her ballast, and we had traded her for a boat. "Then she might be alive," I said. "She's alive," Boyd said, with no drama in it at all, the way you'd state the weather. "Kessler doesn't die in a jungle. A jungle is where Kessler is at her best. The question was never whether she made it. The question is what she's been doing with the days you gave her." He said you gave her without heat, but he said it, and I felt it land in the exact place I deserved. Marsh chose that moment to insert himself, because men like Marsh cannot bear to be the smallest thing in a yard. "With respect, Master Chief," he said, in a voice that had none, "I made a field call to save 11 lives against 1. I'd make it again. You can dress her up however you like." Boyd turned to him. He didn't raise his voice. I have thought about this a great deal since, that the most powerful men I have known lower their voices, they don't raise them. "You made a call," Boyd said, "to leave a naval special warfare operator behind because you decided what she was worth by looking at her. You looked at the best trained person in your element and you saw ballast because she was quiet and because she didn't look like your idea of it. That's not a field call. That's a failure of your eyes." He let that sit. Pray she's forgiving. She's better at this than you are at anything. And he walked away from Marsh and left him standing in the rain with his loud watch. And Marsh had, for once in the time I knew him, nothing at all to say. That night the SEALs staged their gear and planned by red light in the ops shack, and I hung at the edge of it because no one told me to leave, and I listened to them talk about the Marisol like a problem with a solution, and I began, for the first time since the boat, to hope. They were building a plan to go north and find her and pull her out. They had overhead. They had a track on the militia camp that the desk believed held the missing contractor and, possibly, other captured men from a convoy hid a week before us. They were good, and they were calm, and they were coming for her. They were still building that plan at dawn when the perimeter guard called in a single figure walking out of the tree line on the north trace, slow and unafraid, hands empty and visible, headed for the wire. It was her. I was at the wire before I decided to be. She came up the last of the trace out of the green like the green was giving her back, and I will tell you what 4 days alone in the Marisol had done to Dana Kessler, because I have never forgotten a detail of it. She had lost weight she did not have to lose. Her fatigues were black with rot and river, and torn at one forearm over a wound. she'd bound with something stripped from the jungle itself. There was a long, shallow cut healing along her jaw, and her lips were cracked, and her eyes were sunk back in her head. She had a captured militia rifle across her chest, carried right, and a militiaman's pouch of magazines, and a machete that wasn't ours, and she moved on feet that had to be ruined, and she did not let it show in her walk. She had walked into that jungle as the person we underestimated, and she walked out of it looking like something the jungle had failed to keep. She stopped at the wire. The young perimeter guard didn't know what to do with her and looked back for someone with rank. And Master Chief Boyd came out of the ops shack into the gray morning and stopped when he saw her. And for one moment the hardest man in that yard just looked at her across 40 feet of mud. And then he came to a position of attention I had not seen him hold for anyone, and he held it. "Chief," he said. "Master Chief," she said. Her voice was a ruin, sanded down to almost nothing, and it was steady. "You took your time. We were about to come get you." "I know," she said. "I saw your bird coming yesterday. I was 3 ridges out. I'd have signaled, but I was busy." She came through the wire, and she stood there swaying very slightly, running on the last of whatever she had, and she looked past Boyd at the yard at the 11 of us, and she found Marsh, and then she found me. I made myself hold her eyes. It was the hardest thing I had done in that country. There was no accusation in them. That was the worst of it. There was just recognition. She saw exactly who I was and exactly what I had let happen, and she had already, somewhere out in that green, set it down as too small to carry. "I need water, and I need 10 minutes, and I need the man planning the recovery," she said to Boyd. "Because I've already found your camp. I've been sitting on it for 2 days. I know the trails in, I know the sentries, I know where they're holding the prisoners, and I know when the relief shift makes them soft. You've got men in there, ours and theirs, and there's a window." Boyd looked at her, torn between getting her to a medic and the thing every operator in that yard could feel, that the person who just walked out of the jungle knew more about the objective than all their overhead had told them. "You've been doing reconnaissance," he said slowly, "for 4 days, alone on a militia camp, after they left you for dead." "They didn't leave me for dead," Kessler said. She said it without looking at Marsh, and it was somehow worse than if she had. "They left me. I decided what to do with that. I went to work." She swayed again and caught herself. "The men who are still in that camp didn't leave anybody. Let's go get them." They got water into her, and a medic looked at the forearm, and she waved him off after 90 seconds. And then she knelt in the dirt of the ops shack floor and drew the militia camp from memory. And I watched 8 of the most capable men I had ever seen lean in and go quiet and let her. She drew it in the mud with the point of her machete. The river's bend, the ground rising away from it, the camp set on a shelf of high ground with the trails coming in like spokes. She marked the sentry positions, and she marked how they changed and at what hours, because she had lain in the green above that camp for 2 days and nights and counted them. She marked the long house where the prisoners were held, 4 of ours from the convoy, she said, and the missing contractor, all alive as of the previous dusk. She'd seen them taken to the water line under guard and back. She marked the militia strength and where the machine gun sat, and where the ammunition was, and where the ground would channel men into killing if you pushed them wrong, and where it would let you slip if you knew it. "Here," she said, and the machete point touched a fold in the ground north of the camp, "is a draw the map doesn't show because the canopy hides it. It comes in above the long house. It's steep and it's loud in the rain, and there's no easy way down it, which is why they don't watch it. I've been up and down it twice. In the rain, at the shift change, a small element can be inside their wire before they know the green moved." She looked up at Boyd. "I'll walk you in. I know every route on that draw." One of the younger SEALs, sharp-faced, maybe my age, spoke before he thought. "Chief, no offense, you've been on your feet 4 days, you're torn up. We can take the sketch and run it. You don't have to walk back into that." She looked at him, and it was not unkind. "Son, that draw isn't a sketch, it's a feel. It's where the mud's firm, and where it isn't, it's the one route that holds and the one that pulls. I can hand you the map, or I can hand you me. Which do you want, walking point in the dark on a slope you've never touched?" The young SEAL shut his mouth. Boyd almost smiled. "She walks us in," Boyd said. "It wasn't a question to the room, it was a decision. Somebody get her real food and a dry top. Chief, you get 2 hours off your feet whether you like it or not. We move at last light." Kessler stood slow, and for just a moment she let the medic near her forearm again, and as she passed me on her way out of the shack she stopped. I braced for it. I had earned whatever it was. "You kept saying my name," she said quietly, "just for me. The kid on the radio, Boyd told me. 11 of you came back and one of you kept saying my name." She studied me a second. "That's not nothing. Don't let anybody, including you, tell you it was nothing." And she went out into the rain to sleep 2 hours before she led armed men back into the place she'd escaped. And I stood in the ops shack with my throat closed, and understood that she had just given me more grace than I had given her. By a distance I would spend years trying to close. We moved at last light, and I moved with them, because Boyd looked at me and said the radio comes, and because Kessler said, "Bring the kid. He's steady and he learns," which was the single most valuable thing anyone said about me in that whole tour. 9 of us went north into the green, the 8 SEALs and me on the radio, with Kessler walking point ahead of all of us. Marsh did not come. Marsh was told he was staying to help hold the outpost, and he took it as the mercy it wasn't, and I watched him watch us go. And I have wondered since whether the worst punishment that man ever received was standing in the wire watching the woman he'd called Ballast lead a special warfare platoon into the jungle to clean up what his panic had left. I cannot tell you the Marisol at night the way it deserves. It was total. The canopy killed the moon. We moved on Kessler's pace and Kessler's line, and I understood within the first hour what Boyd had meant, because I had walked that jungle for months and I had never walked it like this. She read it. She put her hand up and we froze, and a militia patrol I never saw passed somewhere ahead in the black and moved on, and she waited exactly long enough, and then flowed us forward through the gap she'd known would open. She found firm ground for 8 big men and a scared radio operator to cross a stream without a sound. When the rain came, hard, drumming the canopy into a roar, she used it, pushed the pace under the cover of the noise, because she'd told us the rain was our friend and the shift change was our window, and the two were about to arrive together. We reached the head of her draw a little before midnight. And it was everything she'd said, steep and slick and mean, and she took us down it one at a time on a line she knew by feel, whispering the ground back to us, root here, hold left, the mud soft on the right, trust the vine, and 8 men who trusted almost nothing trusted her completely, in the dark, on a slope above an armed camp, because she had already survived it and come back to lead them through it. I went down that draw with my heart in my throat and her voice in my ear, and I did not fall, because she told me where the ground was, and the ground was where she said. We came out of the draw above the long house, inside their wire, exactly as she'd promised, into the last stretch of a militia camp at the soft, sleepy bottom of a shift change in the rain, and the SEALs went to work. I had never seen professional violence done at close range by men who had made a study of it, and I hope never to need to see it again, and I will not dress it up, because Kessler wouldn't have. It was fast and it was quiet and it was terribly economical. The sentries at the 2 positions she'd marked went down before they knew the green had moved, taken by shapes that had been rain a second before. The machine gun she'd marked never fired, because 2 of Boyd's men were on it before the man beside it woke. She had given them the camp, every position, every angle, every soft hour, and they spent what she gave them like professionals, which is to say without waste and without a wasted life on our side. But it did not stay quiet, because it never does. A militiaman came out of a lean-to at the wrong moment and got a shout out before he was put down, and then the camp came awake all at once, and the calm went a noise the way the patrol had gone to noise 4 days before, except that this time we were the ones who owned the ground, because Kessler had made us own it. Muzzle flashes bloomed across the shelf. Boyd's voice cut through the rain, low and absolute, moving his men, and Kessler moved with them. Not behind them with them, that captured rifle up and firing in the same deliberate pairs I'd watched from the mud on the trail, two and a pause and two, each one meaning something. She had told them she'd take the long house with the assault team because she knew exactly which door and which guard, and she did. And I was on her heels with the radio because Boyd had put me there. And because there was nowhere in that whole world I would rather have been than in the wake of Dana Kessler. There was a guard on the long house. He was bringing his weapon up on the door when Kessler came around the corner of it, and she did not hesitate and she did not miss. And then she was through the door into the dark of the place where they'd kept the men, and I came in behind her with the flashlight Boyd had made me carry, and the beam swung across the inside of the worst room I have ever entered. 5 men, 4 in the ragged remains of our uniform, 1 in the filthy civilian gear of a contractor, bound at the wrists, roped to a low beam, weeks of the jungle and the militia written on every one of them, sunken, sick, one barely conscious against the shoulder of the man beside him. When my light hit them, they flinched from it, because the last several times a light had come into that room it had not meant rescue. And then Kessler spoke, that ruined, steady voice, and she said the thing that I think about more than any other thing from that whole tour. "United States Navy," she said. "We're getting you out. Nobody left you." And she said nobody left you looking straight at them, and I understood she was saying it as much to herself as to them, closing something that Marsh and the boat and 11 of us had torn open, refusing to let one more man in a jungle believe he'd been written off, because she knew, better than any of us would ever know, exactly what that belief did to a person alone in the dark. She was already cutting them loose. The machete she'd carried out of the jungle went through the ropes like they were the vines they were, and she was talking the whole time, low and level, telling them her name and her rank and the plan, telling them the ridge was ours and the birds were coming, and their part was only to hold onto the man next to them and move when she said move. The 4 soldiers came back to themselves under that voice, the way the young seal had shut his mouth under it, the way Ochoa had answered it on the trail. It was a voice you obeyed because it had never once been wrong. The contractor was the last one she reached, and when my light steadied on his face I knew him. He was Marsh's man, the one who'd gone missing on the ridge, the one they'd stopped counting. He was the reason the SEALs had a camp to raid at all. And Dana Kessler, who had been left in that jungle by his boss and his element, knelt down in the filth and cut the ropes off Del Marsh's man with the same care she'd used on the others, and told him nobody left you, and got him on his feet. We brought them out through the draw she'd brought us in by, and it was slower going up than down with 5 broken men to move, and the militia that was left in the camp behind us was in no shape to follow into that black draw against SEALs who owned it now. Boyd called the birds, and the birds came at first gray light to a clearing Kessler had marked on her mud map 2 days before she had any way of knowing we'd need it, because that was how her mind worked. She had been building the way out the whole time she was building the way in. I was on the radio for the extraction and my hands were steady, and I have always been quietly proud of that when it counted my hands were steady, and I think it was because of her. We got the 5 recovered men on the first bird with a medic already working. We got the platoon out. Nobody on our side died in that camp. 4 of our soldiers and 1 contractor came home who had been written into the ground. And they came home because a woman we called Ballast had refused to die in a jungle and had spent the days we gave her turning her abandonment into a plan. She came out on the last bird, and I came out with her. She sat against the bulkhead with her ruined feet finally up and her eyes half closed, that captured rifle across her knees, and Master Chief Boyd sat across from her, and for a while nobody said anything over the rotor noise. Then Boyd leaned forward and he said something to her I only half caught, and she almost smiled, and I saw the hardest man I'd met in that country look at her with something I can only call reverence. Not because she was a woman, not in spite of it, but because she was, flatly and provably, the best of them, and every man on that bird knew it now. At Outpost Kazan the whole yard was waiting, because word travels and word had traveled. The 11 of us who'd come back in the boat were there, and Marsh was there at the edge of it. And when Kessler came off the bird, helped down, finally letting herself be helped, the yard went still. She stood in the mud she'd been abandoned into, with the men she'd saved being carried past her to the aid station, and she looked at Marsh across that yard, and Marsh, who always had a version of events, had no version left. His mouth worked and nothing came out, and Kessler did not spend one word on him. That was the whole of her answer to Del Marsh. She looked at him, she found nothing there worth the breath, and she looked away. I have never seen a man made smaller. Then Master Chief Boyd, in front of the outpost, in front of Ray's and the contractors and the 11 of us, came to attention and saluted her, and every operator in that platoon did the same. And after a frozen second, Captain Ray's did, and then Ochoa's men, and then me, all of us. The whole muddy yard, saluting the analyst, the ballast, the clipboard, the woman we had left in the jungle and who had come back at the head of the cavalry to save the men we couldn't. She stood there and let it land, and she did not gloat and she did not weep. She brought her own hand up, slow and correct, and returned it to the yard. And then Chief Petty Officer Dana Kessler said the only thing she said to all of us together, in that sanded-down voice, and it was not about herself. "There are 5 men going home who thought nobody was coming," she said. "Remember that the next time you decide what somebody's worth by looking at them." She held it a beat. "You can't see what stings you until you're in it." Then she let the medic take her arm, and she walked to the aid station on her own feet, because she was going to walk there on her own feet, and the yard held its salute until she was through the door. I got older after that. I want to close on the older part, because the young radio operator in the boat doesn't get to have the last word. He didn't earn it. I stayed in. I made something of myself. And I will tell you honestly that I made it on a debt, because for the rest of my time in uniform, whenever I caught myself sizing up the quiet one, the small one, the one who didn't look like my idea of it, the one carrying her own ruck easy off the ramp, I heard that ruined voice say you can't see what stings you until you're in it, and I gave that person the second look I had not given Dana Kessler. It made me better at my job. More than that, it made me less of a fool, which is a harder and more useful thing. I never served with her again. Special reconnaissance is a small, quiet world, and it stayed quiet, the way she liked the ground to be quiet. I heard her name once or twice over the years, always from men who lowered their voices to say it. I heard she went back to teaching evasion, teaching young operators how to be one person alone in the green and come out the far side of it functioning, and I thought, of course. Of course she spends her life making sure the next person left in a jungle knows how to come back. She'd been telling that room of prisoners nobody left you. She spent the rest of her career making it true for people she'd never meet. Del Marsh rotated out and I never heard his name again, and I have made my peace with never hearing it, which is its own kind of verdict. Ochoa kept his leg and sent me a note years later that said one line, "You kept saying her name." I keep that note. It is not much and it is everything. But the thing I carry, the thing I will carry to the end, is the salute in that muddy yard, not because a salute settles anything, but because of what it corrected. We had looked at the most capable person among us and decided she was the least. We had traded her for a boat. And she had answered that not with rage and not with tears and not with a word of revenge, but by walking back into the jungle that we'd left her in and leading the cavalry through it to save the men we couldn't reach, and then by telling us, in a voice worn down to nothing, to have better eyes. She came back for the men who left her. She freed the man whose boss abandoned her. She never once made it about the wound. You don't see the thing that stings you until you're already in it. I was 23 and I was in it, and I never saw her coming. God willing, I never missed the next one.